Welcome. My name is Brian Lantz, and I and Joel DeJean are going to be giving the meeting today, and we're going to present, I think, some really provocative ideas, and provocative in the sense of that will challenge you to see the world as a real scientist as opposed to a mathematician. Attempts to the method he uses or she uses to try to discover in front of their nose, but other people don't see. And if that seems kind of a paradoxical, we'll get to that. I'm going to be giving a strategic update briefly. I'll try to keep it brief. And then Joel DeJean will be making the presentation, the feature presentation on the orbit of Mercury, the transit of Mercury across the sun, and what that's represented as a laboratory. This is my wording of it, for scientists from Kepler through Einstein. What I'd like to do to start out with in terms of an approach is actually take up an old friend of ours, Edgar Allan Poe, the great writer, novelist, member of the Society of Cincinnati, one of the leading intelligence service officers of this country in the war against the British Empire. He died in 1849. Today he's known even shortly after he was gone and buried. The slander operations against him tried to turn him into what we now call a writer of the macabre. But if you remember reading some of Edgar Allan Poe when you were in school, or you've read Edgar Allan Poe otherwise, you'll recall that he grips you. You're gripped by the train of thought, the ideas presented. So I'm going to start here with a reference to, and I'm going to read a few brief sections of the Purloined Letter Principle, which was a work completed in 1844, and he considered it one of his best works. And keep in mind that this is Edgar Allan Poe engaged in epistemological warfare, engaged in educating Americans to understand the unseen enemy that lurks in their own thinking, their own habits of thinking. And certainly now, as people have seen with the explosion of the 28 pages case, the sudden passage in the U.S. Senate unanimously of the JASTA bill, we are in a period of really remarkable shift that is occurring. And that's occurring not only in this country, but in the world. And for many, this is completely unforeseen. So if you've forgotten the Purloined Letter Principle, the plot, if you will, of it, briefly, just a few highlights. It centers around a specific character, a fictional amateur detective named Auguste Dupin, a Frenchman. Police has come to Dupin because he has a case. It's also a crisis for the country, potentially. And he, as the head of the police, has to have this case solved. And he has not been able to solve it. And in short, and I'm being very brief here, and it's really worth reading for many reasons, the entire short story. And it is a short story, it's not a novel. The case is as follows. A member of royalty in France has had a document stolen from him. And if that document becomes public, that person will be severely compromised. It'll be a disaster. And the prefect of police has the responsibility to find that document. Now, it's known that a certain minister has stolen that document because he was seen stealing the document. The prefect of police has sent his investigators, who are very competent investigators, and they've gone to the apartment of this minister, Minister D. We don't know his whole name. It's, you know, very mysterious. Who is this Minister D? And they have, unbeknownst to the minister, completely gone over the apartment. You know, used long needles to poke through pillows to try to see if something is hidden inside of them. You know, basically, short of turning the apartment upside down, they've gone through every inch of it, but without disturbing anything. But they found nothing. And they know, because the document has not been made public, that it has to be still in the hands of the minister. And Dupin and the amateur investigator, the gentleman who's standing in for Edgar Allan Poe, you could say, agrees that he must still have it in his possession so that he can use it at a moment's notice and as required. So it has to be somewhere on the premises of this apartment, or it would seem so. But the perfect of police is beside himself. He's come to Dupin for a solution. So picking it up, here is what Dupin tells his friend who's there and has just had this discussion with the perfect of police. Dupin has offered to take up the case. Dupin says, "The Parisian police are exceedingly able in their way. They are persevering, ingenious, cunning, and thoroughly versed in the knowledge which their duties seem chiefly to demand. I felt entirely confident in his having made a satisfactory investigation, so far as his labors extended." As far as his labors extended, said I? Yes, said Dupin. The measures adopted were not only the best of their kind, but carried out to absolute perfection. Had the letter been deposited within the range of their search, these fellows would, beyond a question, have found it. And his friend laughs at this. How could this be? You know, how could they have done everything perfectly and not found the document if it was there? All right. Dupin answers, I'm skipping over some of the text, but he answers that the key is in the identification of the reasoner's intellect with that of his opponent. I'll repeat that. The identification of the reasoner's intellect with that of his opponent. You have to know your enemy. You have to know who you're dealing with. And the identification, Dupin goes on, of the reasoner's intellect with that of his opponent depends, this was his friend speaking, if I understand you, that is Dupin, right, upon the accuracy with which the opponent's intellect is measured. For this practical value, it depends on this, replied Dupin. And the perfect and his cohort fail so frequently, first, by default of their identification, and secondly, by ill-admeasurement, or rather through non-admeasurement of the intellect with which they are engaged. They don't know their enemy. They don't know how he or she thinks. They consider only their own ideas of ingenuity, and in searching for anything hidden, advert only to the modes in which they would have hidden it. They are right in this much, that their own ingenuity is a faithful representative of that of the mass, right, of the larger population. But when the cunning of the individual felon is diverse in character from their own, the felon foils them, of course. So continue here. This is the purloined letter principle of Edgar Allan Poe. And he's not, he's speaking of things very substantive here, not fictional. He continues, you will now understand what I meant in suggesting that had the purloined letter been hidden anywhere within the limits of the perfect's examination, right, the chief of police's examination. In other words, had the principle of its concealment been comprehended within the principles of the perfect, within the mind of the police chief, its discovery would have been a matter altogether beyond question. This functionary, however, has been thoroughly mystified, and the remote source of his defeat lies in the supposition that the minister is a fool, because he has acquired renown as a poet. The Minister D, the suspect, known to have stolen the document, has gained renown on the side as a poet. And therefore, Dupin is saying, the police chief says, he's a poet, he's a fool. Mm-hmm. All right? All fools are poets. This is what the police chief thinks Dupin is saying. This the perfect feels, right? And he is merely guilty of inferring that all poets are fools. But is this really the poet? I know him as his friend asked Dupin. There are two brothers. This minister, I believe, is learned in the differential calculus. He is a mathematician and no poet. You are mistaken, Dupin responds. I know him well. He is both. As poet and mathematician, he would reason well. As mere mathematician, he could not have reasoned at all. As a mere mathematician, he could not have reasoned at all, and thus would have been at the mercy of the perfect. You surprised me, I said, by this opinions, which have been contradicted by the voice of the world. You do not mean to set at naught the well-digested idea of centuries. The mathematical reason has long been regarded as the reason par excellence. And Dupin brushes this off. And I won't, he then elaborates, expands, dilates upon the failure of mathematics as mere logic, as mere deduction from already known knowledge, from known axioms which themselves are unprovable. And therefore, there's nothing in mathematics that allows for the actual development of I would summarize, new ideas, new concepts. But you have to read it for yourself. You have to read Edgar Allan Poe for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it at all. But picking up the story after this digression, which is really not a digression at all, it's part of the reason Edgar Allan Poe is writing this story, he continues, but the more I reflected upon the daring, dashing, and discriminating ingenuity of D, the minister, the poet, upon the fact that the document must always have been at hand if he intended to use it to good purpose, and upon the decisive evidence obtained by the perfect, that it was not hidden within the limits of that dignitary's ordinary search, the more satisfied I became that to conceal this letter, the minister had resorted to the comprehensive and sagacious expedient of not attempting to conceal it at all. And then he discusses how he went. He arranged a meeting with the minister on some pretense. They knew each other. And while he's in the room, he's wearing colored glasses so the minister can't, on the idea that he had some eye problem. So he can glance around and look sharply in various parts of the room and so forth and assess it without drawing the suspicion of the minister. And he says, at length, my eyes in going the circuit of the room fell upon a temporary filigree card rack of pasteboard that hung dangling by a dirty blue ribbon from a little brass knob just beneath the middle of the mantelpiece. In this rack, which had 3 or 4 compartments, were 5 or 6 visiting cards and a solitary letter. This last was much soiled and crumpled. It was torn nearly in 2 across the middle, as if by design, in the first instance, to tear it nearly up as worthless, had been altered or stayed in the second. It had a large black seal bearing the D, the Minister D cipher, very conspicuously. And it was addressed in a diminutive female hand to D, the minister himself. It was thrust carelessly and even as it seemed contemptuously into one of the upper divisions of the rack. And it turned out that was the letter, which he had folded back on itself, rolled different ways, and put his own stamp on it, and just stuck it there, hanging there in the open, you know, for all to see. That's not the end of the story. That's near the end of the story. But this is the purloined letter principle, that what others think is concealed is right in front of their nose. So let's look at what's unfolding now in the world. Think back with this as kind of a frame of reference, think back to Putin's action, President Putin of Russia. His action only last September to go into Syria with a relatively small force of aircraft and support personnel and backing from the sea and so forth, cruise missiles and so forth, as we came to know. And how within a matter of weeks, he routed ISIS. Not routed them completely, there's still a war going on, but routed them. After the coalition forces under the leadership of our purported commander-in-chief had been waging war for over a year and a half, supposedly with great effort of aircraft, special operations forces, and on and on and on. Yet Putin went into Syria and just virtually as if overnight demolished before the eyes of the entire world this mirage, you know, that had been created as to what was actually going on. Further, by bombing the supply lines from Saudi Arabia and Turkey into Syria, he exposed that this was the source of the mercenaries and weaponry and so forth, and money, hard cash, coming into Syria. You know, that this was hardly a revolt of the masses, of a democratic movement from within Syria at its core. That was what Putin did. And he exposed that to everyone to see who wished to see it. Then so Obama was exposed by this before the eyes of the world. Now let's take what's unfolded now. And there's obviously a connection. We now have the unfolding of the so-called 28 pages issue. It's all over the media. If you haven't seen it, simply put in 28 pages in your search engine and look under news, and you'll find a list, long list of articles, all kinds of articles.
Diane Rehm show a day ago.
Diane Rehm show a day ago. Yeah, New York Times, you name it, Washington Post, senators, congressmen. And then we had this last week the passage of the JASTA bill, the Justice for the Victims of 9/11. A bill passed unanimously in the U.S. Senate, where there's been no such, you know, support for action to bring to justice those responsible for 9/11 up until now. Sudden action, unanimous action on the JASTA bill.
Which is rare in the Senate.
Yes, which is rare in the Senate, it's rare in the Congress. Probably rarer than hen's teeth. Yes. So again, for many a surprise, if you go back to 9/11, 2001, on that day, Lyndon LaRouche was watching the unfolding events on TV and was on the Stockwell show out of, Lyndon was in Virginia, I believe, at the time. Stockwell is in Utah, based in Salt Lake. The show was out of Salt Lake. And so as the events were unfolding, LaRouche was being interviewed on the Stockwell show. And of course, the subject became what was unfolding at that very moment, particularly in New York City, but also at the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania, as it turned out. And LaRouche said, you know, he said, I hope they don't try to blame this on bin Laden, and proceeded to outline what he had presented to the U.S. Congress back in January and February of 2001, that the now incoming Bush-Cheney administration with their agenda of deregulation, budget cuts, smaller government, and so on and so forth, would not be able to carry out these policies under conditions of a collapsing economy, which was obviously, if you remember, 2001 was when the meltdown occurred of the whole dot-com bubble. That they would not be able to maintain control, political control, stability, stable control over the situation without, he said, in January and February, of a Reichstag fire. And that's what happened on September 11, 2001, was a Reichstag fire event, which, as he stated, could not have occurred without complicity of elements within the United States itself, right, to protect the capabilities that would have been required to carry out such a gigantic operation. What did LaRouche see on 9/11, 2001, which most Americans either didn't see or didn't want to see? And there again, we're going to the purloined letter principle that I was just discussing in terms of Edgar Allan Poe. Well worth reading from the standpoint of, again, the nature of epistemological warfare. But this is continuing to unfold, this process. A lot is coming out now. A lot that's challenging, that's going to be challenging for Americans to comprehend, and more importantly, act on. Well, let me just give it on the 28 pages. Let me just mention in passing. We have the statement from the 9/11 families. These are the 9/11 families. That's a short way of referring to the organization that's been created of families who lost loved ones in the 9/11 tragedy, 9/11/2001. And they have been advocating for the release of the 28 pages, the final chapter of the congressional inquiry into 9/11 for years, as we have, as the LaRouche Political Action Committee has. And I would point out that they have held out hope that President Obama, despite 3 times having said he would release the 28 pages, and obviously 3 times so far having not released the 28 pages, that he still would be convinced. But here you see the shifting insight, a process of self-education going on with some help from others as to what's going on. Let me just read briefly from the statement. After thanking those that had brought the bill, the JASTA bill, to passage in the U.S. Senate, it goes on and says their wisdom, that is, those that helped pass it, and leadership has demonstrated an understanding of the need to hold those responsible for funding terrorism accountable. Without accountability, there can be no justice. We look forward to members of the House joining with the citizen, with the Senate, in demonstrating the same level of wisdom and leadership. In light of that goal and in direct response to the Obama administration's statement today that they still strongly continue to oppose this legislation and that they may, quote, seek additional changes to the measure or try to kill it in the House, quote unquote, we would like to respectfully request that the administration refrain from using such violent language when opposing legislation specifically designed and intended to help victims of terrorism. Moreover, we would also like to encourage President Obama to recalibrate his priorities by placing American citizens and victims of terrorism ahead of nations like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, who fund terrorists that want to kill Americans. We are tired of witnessing President Obama block our path to justice. Furthermore, on the weekend of over the weekend at Rutgers University, President Obama, this statement was just this last a few days ago. President Obama stated the following. This is quoting President Obama. In politics and in life, Ignorance is not a virtue. It's not cool to not know what you're talking about. That's not keeping it real or telling it like it is. End of quote. In the spirit of keeping things real, the statement from the 9/11 families continues, we would like to draw Mr. Obama's attention to his own deliberate decision not to read the 28 pages of the joint inquiry of Congress's final report into the 9/11 attacks. Perhaps if Mr. Obama had bothered to read the 28 pages, he would more rightfully comprehend and appreciate the need for JASTA. Ignorance is not bliss.
Whoa.
So here you see, you know, kind of an exploding recognition of a reality that lies beyond the surface. What was not acceded to before, was not accepted before, is now being forced into the public domain, into the daylight. So I think that's very important, and I think this is probably the best point to bring this up. Next Saturday, and this will be carried on the LaRouche PAC website, a living memorial ending war and terrorism will be held in New York City. It'll be addressed by Helga Zepp LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche, and other speakers. Helga Zepp LaRouche will address it on the subject of grand strategy, creativity, and the image of man. Lyndon LaRouche will carry out a dialogue, creating something better than mankind has known before, which will be followed by a wreath-laying and music series of presentations. First, the wreath-laying at the Civil War 7th Regiment Memorial Statue in Central Park, followed by a concert nearby at the Good Shepherd Faith Presbyterian Church there in Manhattan. You can contact your local LaRouche PAC office for details if you're able to attend, but otherwise it will be carried on the website. But LaRouche called for this event, saying that we needed to create a living memorial to recognize that what had been lost, the loss of lives, a living memorial for people who died in 9/11, and as well for Americans to recognize their own humiliation in having accepted up to this point what happened there. That 2,977 people died in 9/11, but in effect, outside of handfuls of people, nothing was done. Nothing was done. And that might recall for some of us the aftermath of the John F. Kennedy assassination, or the Bobby Kennedy assassination, and so forth. So there has to be a kind of cleansing process here, a recognition of what has been lost, of the lives that were lost, but also an expression by the people as a whole for their failure to defend life, human life, when that life was needed. Now, to just briefly back to this question of the Purloined Letter principle, and the relationship to what I've just been presenting very briefly in terms of the unfolding of this 28 pages crisis. This is a book titled Prince. It's been in publication for years, more than a decade, I believe. I didn't look at the date, copyright date. This is you can get this on Amazon.com. It's the authorized biography of Prince Bandar bin Sultan, known as Bandar Bush was his nickname for his close relationship to George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. And he was the U.S. ambassador in Washington, D.C. at the time of 9/11, and as it's reported in the 28 pages, as well as elsewhere, $2 billion having been transferred into his accounts at Riggs National Bank in Washington, D.C., a portion of that money, in the form of checks were written on those accounts of Prince Bandar. Those monies went to hijackers, the first hijackers arriving in the United States, to support them in San Diego, California. In the book, I'm just going to refer briefly to the Al-Yamama, the accord reached between Saudi Arabia and BAE, British Aerospace, BAE, which is their largest, military industrial company, in which Saudi Arabia agreed to pay for. Many of you are probably aware of this. Agreed to pay for fighter jets from Britain, support personnel, all of the logistics that goes with that, in exchange for a tanker of oil a day from Saudi Arabia. And
what year?
Oh boy. Well, it was 85. It was negotiated by Prince Bandar with Margaret Thatcher, then the Prime Minister of Britain. And that agreement continues down to today. And it quickly became noted that the value of a tanker load of oil a day was far more than the cost of the fighters and support and so on and so forth that were going to Saudi Arabia. So I'm just going to pick up this. This is the official biographer reporting from Prince Bandar's position. Although Al-Yamama, that's the name of the accord, it means the dove, which is, of course, ironic in itself, constitutes a highly unconventional way of doing business. Its lucrative spin-offs are the byproducts of a wholly political objective, a Saudi political objective and a British political objective. Al-Yamama is, first and foremost, a political contract. Negotiated at the height of the Cold War, its unique structure has enabled the Saudis to purchase weapons from around the globe to fund the fight against communism. Al-Yamama money can be found in the clandestine purchase of Russian ordnance used in the expulsion of Gaddafi's troops from Chad. It can also be traced to arms bought from Egypt and other countries and sent to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan fighting the Soviet-occupied forces, and on and on and on. In other words, it's in the public domain that Saudi Arabia and the slush fund created by the BAE Al-Yamama Accord, that slush fund was used to fund the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, to fund international terrorism. Remember, bin Laden became a leader of the Mujahideen. Al-Qaeda was an outgrowth of this very apparatus. The bin Laden family that was ambassador, right? Sultan bin Laden at the time of 9/11. And the bin Laden family and friends that were rushed out of the United States on a special jet immediately after 9/11, at the very point when the US skies were still under lockdown, where flights were not being allowed. The one flight that went out was the flight carrying the bin Laden family and friends. So, in other words, what LaRouche saw was not something that couldn't have been comprehended by others. Just as DeJean was not the only person that could have solved the mystery of Minister D and the Palmyra letter. But LaRouche had the temerity to look where others weren't willing to look, in terms of the British hand behind the Saudis, behind 9/11. And more could be said on that. Right now, there's a lot exploding in the world. There's just been the Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, has just spent 2 days in Sochi meeting with Putin. That was about a week ago now, May 6th and 7th. This week has seen the ASEAN summit of all the ASEAN countries, including most of their leaders, in Sochi, again meeting with Putin. You could say everybody in the world is going to meet Putin. He's not exactly isolated. And economic deals, trade agreements, treaties. There's never been a treaty between Japan and Russia since World War II. There was never a treaty ending the war. That's now been kicked into gear as part of this process. In other words, there's a transformation going on, a foreshadowing of a potential alliance between not only Russia, China, and India, but also Japan, as well as the Korea Peninsula, and so on and so forth. This is a rapidly emerging, rapidly developing process. It's emerging in the context of what Putin and LaRouche have exposed, and the resonance between their initiatives going on internationally. But I wanted to come back one more time to this question of the British, which is missed so often, which you see in terms of just a kind of do not go there kind of attitude on the part of most people's own thinking, to even entertain the idea that the Queen might be more than a figurehead kind of thing. But I think to understand that, very briefly, and I'm going to conclude on this, I want to bring up something which some of you know something about, and everyone should know a lot about, which was the Treaty of Westphalia, which does take us back to Johannes Kepler's time, which leads us into Joel DeJean's presentation coming up here in a minute. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 concluded the 30 Years of War, which had reduced the number of parishes in continental Europe by half. It had reduced the population of Europe by almost half. This was the war between Protestants and Catholics. And more than a few times, of course, an analogy has been made between that, a parallel between that period and the period of this apparent war between Islam and Christianity, as some have tried to couch this so-called clash of civilizations going on now. But here, the Treaty of Westphalia concluded that agreement, concluded that war. And it concluded it on the basis of what we'll emphasize as two fundamental principles. I can find my notes here. Article 1 begins, "A Christian general and permanent peace and true and honest friendship must rule between all of the parties," it goes on to state. These are parties that have been fighting for 30 years. I mean, horror stories, similar to what you would think of in terms of what you hear about in terms of ISIS. Right? And this peace must be so honest and seriously guarded and nourished that each part furthers the advantage, honor, and benefit of the other. We're speaking here of nations, that each nation should seek the advantage, honor, and benefit of the other. A faithful neighborliness should be renewed and flourish for peace and friendship and flourish again. And then Article 2, on both sides, all should be forever forgotten and forgiven. This is 30 years of meaning. What has from the beginning of the unrest, no matter how or where, from one side or the other, happened in terms of hostility, neither because of that nor for any other reason or pretext should anyone commit or allow to happen any hostility, unfriendliness, difficulty, or obstacle in respect to persons, their status, goods, and security, secretly or openly, directly or indirectly, under the pretense of the authority of law. Now, I'd have to say that I think most Americans would have problems with that. They would think, oh, well, that's a bunch of pretty words, and rather than argue that, I would just point to the Monroe Doctrine. I would point to Lincoln's attitude as expressed in the Gettysburg Address, to Lincoln's support for Juarez in the founding of the Republic in Mexico, to FDR's Four Freedoms, to the Adams for Peace program of Eisenhower, to the Peace Corps program John F. Kennedy. You know, that in fact, indeed, the United States has, throughout its history, in its better moments, pursued exactly such a Westphalian perspective. And that's not accidental, because all international law, up until the last few decades, has been based on the Treaty of Westphalia. Is the founding document of international law. If you study international law, you start with the Treaty of Westphalia as the groundwork for all international law. Now, in counter-distinction to that, let us turn briefly to Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of Britain. And what does Tony Blair have to say? And this is from remarks he made in 2004. This is just after the invasion of Iraq, which Tony Blair not only supported, but had provided the evidence, much of the so-called evidence of weapons of mass destruction that was then utilized, you know, to convince Colin Powell and the Congress and the American people that we had to go in and destroy Saddam Hussein, and well, we ended up destroying the whole nation. And we're still paying for that today. The world is paying for it today. But here is Tony Blair, that Tony Blair, speaking as Prime Minister. He says, "So for me, before September 11th, I was already reaching for a different philosophy in international relations from the traditional one that has held sway since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Namely, that a country's internal affairs are for it, and you don't interfere unless it threatens you or breaches a treaty or triggers an obligation of alliance. I did not consider Iraq fitted into this philosophy." He goes on to say, "The best defense of our security lies in the spread of our values. But we cannot advance these values except within a framework that recognizes their universality. In other words, it's our way or the highway. If it is a global threat, it needs a global response based on global rules. The essence of a community is common rights and responsibilities. We have obligations in relation to each other. If we are threatened, we have a right to act." And there you see some of the gibberish, and you can see how some of it begins to sound reasonable. But what's at the core of this? What's the core of this is that we're going to overthrow, and this is what he elaborates in great detail, we're overthrowing the principles of the Treaty of Westphalia, the principles of international law, and establish a principle in the context of globalization, where the nation is no longer sacrosanct. But we have a right to ensure our values and ensure our safety against anyone else's values, that those governments, if necessary, be overthrown. And that's the British method. And if you think in terms of the last 16 years of Bush administrations and Obama administrations of endless war, just continual endless war to no purpose in terms of the United States, in terms of its actual security and sovereignty, you see the British hand through both the Bush administration, Bush Cheney, and Obama. There's an old saying that that the sun never sits on the British Empire. More recently, somebody said the British Empire faked its own death back after World War II. Kind of more to the point, drawing on a comment that was made last week, that there's nothing new under the sun, a biblical statement. I'm going to invite Joel DeJean to come up and actually explore what that statement actually means. And I think Edgar Allan Poe will appreciate his remarks, and then we'll take questions afterwards.
Okay.
Joel, want to come around here to the Someone also said that
reason why the sun doesn't set on the British Empire is so that I can keep my eye on it.
Yeah, right.
What? Can you repeat that, Brian?
Joel said, it's also said, I think it's an Irish expression, I'm not sure, but the reason the sun never sets on the British Empire is so that God can keep his eye on him.
Ah, hey.
All right. Should I go ahead and hand out these Keplers?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to go ahead and hand this is, you can just take this with you. It's not necessary to read now.
Get the marker.
Oh, I'm sorry. I moved it, didn't I?
Oh, okay.
Here.
Yeah, don't move the furniture.
Yeah, right. This is Albert Einstein on Johannes Kepler, written on the 300th anniversary of his death.
I wanted to take you on a short tour of the solar system, beginning with Mercury. Now, on May 9th, just a couple of weeks ago, Mercury, in the early morning, began what's known as a transit of the surface of the sun. And I'll just describe it to you using, imagine this is the surface of the sun. So at approximately 6 o'clock Monday morning, on May 9th.
Oh, Joel, you want to step back in front of the camera?
All right, get it, catch this?
Yeah, I can't catch that part. On that end, it can catch it.
Okay.
You want me to turn it?
I guess you.
Well, that's right. I'll just show you. So you had Mercury across the face of the sun. Now, how many people saw that?
No hands right now.
Well, I thought I saw something there.
You saw the spots?
You're right.
Okay, yeah. But like was mentioned earlier, Mercury has been crossing the face of the sun for billions of years. So what's the big deal?
Yeah, what's the
Well, first off, the first observation of a transit of the sun occurred in 1631. It was due to a forecast, a prediction made by Johannes Kepler before he died in 1630. Now, Kepler, as Einstein describes in that letter that Brian handed out, Kepler lived in very turbulent times. He lived in the middle of the 30 Years' War. His grandfather was a mayor of a small town in Germany. His father had died when Kepler was 5 years old. He died as it's thought that he was a mercenary for the Holy Roman Empire. Now, Kepler, when he was 6 years old, was taken by his mother to observe a nova, a supernova, which was thought to be a birth of a new star. Now, the birth of a new star right there violated what was assumed about the heavens, that the heavens were perfect, were unchanging. And Kepler went on to study math and astronomy, and he wrote a series of very important books, including the New Astronomy, which was printed in 1609, and the Harmony of the World in 1619, which we in Houston are reading through that work. Now, during his lifetime, as Einstein points out 300 years later, few people understood Kepler. As a matter of fact, Kepler sent his book, The New Astronomy, to Galileo, to Rene Descartes, and received no response. Now, at that time, it was assumed that it was accepted that the Earth revolved around the sun. This was after Copernicus, but it was still accepted that the orbits of all the planets were perfectly circular. And Kepler, through his work, goes on to shadow that. Now, after his death, approximately a year later, an Italian astronomer, Gleaned, using Kepler's tables. Kepler, after the Harmony of the World, worked on what was known as the Rudolphine tables, which were a series of detailed mapping of the positions of all the planets. He based his work on the data from Tycho Brahe, and this work was used by the Italian astronomer to look for this transit of Mercury across the face of the sun. Now, at that point, in 1630, there was only one man, one human being, who forecast that this would occur. Now, again, you say, well, what's the big deal? Well, not only can you tell the speed of the planet by measuring how long it takes to cross the face of the sun, you could also use parallax to determine the distance from the Earth to the planet and also from the Earth to the sun. Now, after Kepler's death, the Mercury of transit was detected. A few years later, the transit of Venus across the face of the sun was detected. So those transits confirmed Kepler's view of the solar system, the harmony of the solar system. Now, at that point, you had others, and this is attributed to Newton and others, took Kepler's work and formalized it, created formulas to describe what gravity was. And Newton is credited with the formal description of gravity, although the concept comes from Kepler. Now, using these force equations, the rest of the solar system was mapped out. Now, in 1781, another astronomer, William Herschel, who was German but was working in England, using his own telescope and observing the sky, detects motion and detects what became known as the new planet, the seventh planet. Because up to now, all through thousands of years, we had 6 known planets. Mercury being closest to the sun, Venus and Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and it was thought Saturn was the last planet. But William Herschel, using an improved telescope, was able to spot Uranus, which you can't really see with the naked eye without assistance of a telescope. So Uranus was mapped out. And by the way, the orbital period of Uranus is about 85 years. So throughout the early 1800s, astronomers went about to describe in greater detail the orbit of Uranus. Now, a French astronomer in the mid-1800s, looking at the orbit of Uranus, detected that there were fluctuations in the expected position of Uranus. Now, at that point, it was assumed that the equations, the descriptions of the orbits, based on Kepler and what's attributed to Newton, those equations were perfect, that either there was a mistake in the observation or there was a mistake in the assumptions that were the basis of these force equations. Now, what this French astronomer determined is that none of those were the case, that instead of a mistake in the equations, he hypothesized that the fluctuations of the orbit of Uranus was due to another planet, another body outside the orbit of Uranus, which was influencing the position of Uranus. And he predicted, just like Kepler had predicted hundreds of years before on the transit of Mercury, Leverrier predicted that if astronomers were to look in a certain quadrant of the sky in 1846, they would detect a new planet. And sure enough, in 1846, they detected a new planet, which is now known as Neptune, which has an orbital period of about 165 years. Now, the other planets, they kept refining the orbits, making it more accurate, and going back to Mercury. In the mid-1800s, it was determined that there was something wrong with Mercury's orbit. Now, using this as a model, this is the sphere. Pretend this is the sun. Now, to scale, if this is the sun, I don't know, about 10,000 degrees. But if I were to put the orbit of Mercury to scale for this sun, Mercury would be about 45 feet from this sphere.
45 diameters?
45 feet.
45 feet.
Yeah, or basically, if this is a foot, or the diameter of the sun is about 800,000 miles. And to scale, Mercury in this model would be out the door. It would be in the hallway somewhere. And Mercury has a tilted orbit. That's why when it goes around the sun, it just doesn't go around the same spot all the time. It takes 88 days for Mercury to revolve around the sun. Now, its orbit is tilted 7 degrees, so that in a century, in 100 years, it will transit the face of the sun as seen from Earth only 13 times. Now, Mercury has the most elliptical orbit of all the planets. So its closest approach, which is the perihelion, is 29 million miles from the sun. Its furthest, or aphelion, is around 40 million miles. Now, people have described the solar system like a clock. Everything comes back to its original point. That's not accurate, because what was observed is that because of the influence of the other planets on Mercury, that the point closest to the sun, the perihelion, every 88 days doesn't come back to the exact same point. It has a precession. Just like the precession of the equinox on Earth, there's a precession of Mercury's orbit around the sun. And using the force equations, this was accounted for. But over the years, the precession of Mercury's orbit could not be accounted for. That there was a discrepancy, a very small discrepancy, about 43 arc seconds per century, very small. But it was significant enough that the same French astronomer, Leverrier, using the method that he used to discover Neptune. And remember, Neptune was under the sun. He was out there all along. But using the Kepler and the formalized equations, he was able to detect Neptune without observation, using Kepler's laws. So he figured, well, if it worked out there, it should work for Mercury to explain this discrepancy, what was now known as the perturbation of the precession of the perihelion of Mercury. So he, looking at this orbit and this discrepancy, he figured that, well, there must be a mass between the orbit of Mercury and the sun to account for this fluctuation of the orbit. And he asked the astronomers of the day, to look for a smaller planet between Mercury and the Sun. And the only way to detect it, because of the brightness and the glare from the Sun, would be to observe a transit. And in 1860, an amateur French astronomer, looking at the Sun, of course using the proper filters, determines that he sees something going across the face of the Sun, which is not Mercury, it's not Venus. And he says that this is the missing planet. So he decided, and the astronomy departments decided, well, let's call this new planet Vulcan in honor of the god of fire. So in the following decades, astronomers try to repeat that observation and are unable to do so. But every 10 years or so, some astronomer will look and see a sunspot and think that's the planet Vulcan. And this planet, people are looking for this for about 50 years. And they don't want to give up on the idea, because to give up on the idea would leave this discrepancy in Mercury's orbit unresolved. So they have faith that if they keep looking, just like the detective, just like the perfect, that if they keep looking with greater and greater detail, they'll be able to pick out that planet. Well, it's not until 1915 when a now famous physicist, who has become famous because of his special relativity, which is Einstein, he is working on a more expansive theory, his general theory, to account for not just uniform motion, but for acceleration and gravity. He's looking for a better description of gravity, because up to now, and Newton is famous for this quote, he gives this formula to gravity. And he was asked, well, what is gravity? And he says, I make no hypothesis. All I do is describe. So he is famous for saying that I make no hypothesis. But Einstein wasn't satisfied with that. He says, what is the cause of this gravitational force? And throughout the 1910 up to 1915, he works out a new representation of gravity, which explains gravity as the curvature of what's known as space-time. And using his new concept, Einstein takes the observed precession of Mercury's orbit over the years, and using his new formulation is able to explain to the arcsecond why Mercury has this perturbation in its orbit. It's explained by the warping of space-time near a great mass like the Sun. And this explanation of the perturbation of Mercury's orbit kills Vulcan. It explains away, you don't need this other mass in between Mercury and the Sun. And explains exactly why Mercury behaves like it does. And Einstein, in that paper that Brian handed out in 1930, writes a letter to the editor, to the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Is that the paper that it was in?
Frankfurter Zeitung.
Frankfurter Zeitung. Okay, can you read the first paragraph of that letter? You got the copy?
Yeah.
Or Louise or anybody?
Or anyone up front? Yeah.
Anybody who hasn't.
Okay, the first paragraph, Joel?
Yeah, the
Okay.
very beginning.
Okay, so it's on the occasion of the 300th anniversary of Kepler's death. Okay, this was published in the Frankfurter Zeitung, November 9th, 1930. In anxious and uncertain times like ours, when it is difficult to find pleasure in humanity, and the course of human affairs, it is particularly consoling to think of such a supreme and quiet man as Kepler. Kepler lived in an age in which the reign of law and nature was as yet by no means certain. How great must his faith in the existence of natural law have been to give him the strength to devote decades of hard and patient work to the empirical investigation of planetary motion and the mathematical laws of that motion, entirely on his own, supported by no one and understood by very few. If we would honor his memory fittingly, we must get as clear a picture as we can of his problem and the stages of its solution.
I think that paragraph explains, it's a good description of Einstein himself, because in the early 1900s, he was understood by very few, and he was forced out of Germany and basically was given this position in Princeton, where he was honored, but he wasn't listened to at that time. So you see that throughout history, science has progressed not by consensus. Because if you think about it, in 1630, if you were to take a poll of all the world's astronomers, and you were to ask, can we predict the transit of a planet across the face of the sun? Most of the astronomers, I'm sure 97.7% would say, no, that's just impossible. So it was one man, one human mind was able to figure out the laws governing planetary motion. It was able to use those laws to make a forecast to tell where the position of the planets would be in the future. In the same way, Einstein was able to use his mind to look at what is really behind the movement of mass and explain not only gravity, but also explain light and also explain what has become known as the quantum. Now, the same week where we saw the transit of Mercury across the sun, it was reported that an aptly named satellite Kepler, was able to detect over the years. It's been up in space for about 7 years now. And its job is to look at a small portion of the sky, about 1% of the sky. Or it said if you stick your hand out, and the amount of area covered by your hand is the area of stars that Kepler is looking at, the satellite. And it has been able to detect, using the method of transit, observing for planets crossing the face of distant suns. It has been able to detect, it's up to something like 2,000, what's called exoplanets, planets outside our solar system.
2,000.
And that satellite would not exist if it hadn't been for Einstein with his collaborator Max Planck figuring out what's now known as the photoelectric effect, to be able to build detectors which can detect light from hundreds of thousands of light years away and turn that light into a signal which then can be interpreted as the fluctuation of a distant sun, which is what you would expect when a planet crosses the path of that sun. So here you have the breakthroughs of Kepler and Einstein are being used to explore the rest of the galaxy and eventually other galaxies. So again, you have this idea of science being just a consensus, which if you look at the history of Kepler, the history of Einstein, the history of any great scientist, as LaRouche has identified, that you have to look at these great scientists to determine what is real science. And I think it's fitting that Einstein, 300 years after the death of Kepler, and again, if you think about it, Kepler had a very hard life. His first wife died of smallpox. Several of his children died of smallpox. He himself had contracted smallpox as a youth, and it had damaged his eyesight. Now, he was a mathematician for emperors. He was an advisor to one of the top generals of the 30 Years' War, General Wallenstein. So you would think he had a high-level position, but he did have a high-level position, and he had an official stipend, but he never got a stipend. So he actually died of starvation in the middle of the 30 Years' War. A few years before that, his mother had been tried as a witch, basically as a witch hunt against Kepler, targeting his mother. He had to defend her from the charges. And Kepler went from the Protestant to the Catholic side. He was the court mathematician for the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And he was asked repeatedly to convert to Catholicism. He refused repeatedly. But he wasn't just with the Protestants, he was in search of a higher truth. So he died basically at the point where he was about to publish his tables on the planets. And because of the chaos of the 30 Years' War, he had to publish the first edition with his own money. So he didn't die a wealthy man. As a matter of fact, I think his gravesite was desecrated during the remainder of the 30 Years' War. But today, he, with the revival of Kepler, initiated by LaRouche through his basement research team, is now given the full credit that is due. And if you look throughout history, Kepler, Leibniz, Einstein, these are the great minds that we have to emulate if we're going to continue to progress in the coming years. So I'll leave it there and see if there are any questions on the Kepler or Einstein or Lloyd letter.
Thank you.
Oh, turn off the sun here.
Joel, could you say something about how, I mean, I thought it was pretty amazing the way you went through and encapsulated some of these great discoveries, you know, of Einstein's work. Can you discuss a little bit more? Because I know this is kind of the thing that would be maybe the subject of a bigger class on Solvay conference or whatever. But can you discuss more, like you said, that Einstein was given a position at Princeton, but then nobody listened to him. Can you say anything more about what, you know, he was actually engaged in at that point?
Yeah, in the in 1900, Planck was the one who discovered what's become known as the quantum of action. And this states that in the very small, energy is not a continuous function, that it comes in discrete steps. And in 1905, Einstein, using Planck's concept, says that light is also, in the very small, can be considered a particle, a quantum of action, and not just a wave. Now, this overturns hundreds of years of what's called classical physics, Newtonian physics, in that what is smashed at the beginning of the 20th century is the idea that you had these categories. You had space and time. And if you read Newton, he says that space is empty and infinite. And time is constant, unchanging throughout the universe. And in the early 1800s, it was assumed that mass could be converted. In other words, if you burn a cord of wood and you get charcoal or you get soot, that the mass of that soot and the wood is not changed. That the amount of mass is not changed, it's constant. And the same was assumed of energy. It was assumed that you could turn energy from mechanical energy to heat energy to electricity, but the amount of energy could not be changed. So what Einstein did in the beginning of the 20th century is he said that no, space is not just an empty box, and time is not constant. That time changes depending on the observer, that the only constant is the speed of light. And using that concept, he was able to show that mass and energy are equivalent. And this is his famous formulation of that mass is equal to energy. So that the way he put it, energy is equal to the mass that's changed times the speed of light squared. And this leads to the idea that if we're able to tap that energy in mass, we can create a huge amount of energy, 1 million times more energy than just burning wood or natural gas. And this leads to the atomic era. So if you look at around 1930, you have the overturning of what is meant by space, time, mass, and energy. And at that point, just like when Kepler made his breakthrough about planetary motion, you had these scientists like Niels Bohr, supported by Bertrand Russell, and say, okay, we accept this new concept of the quantum of action. But as we get closer and closer to the very small, that the action of matter in the very small is not something that can be predicted with absolute accuracy. And that uncertainty principle is then used to say, well, we can use these new concepts and we can formalize them and say that we can use these formulas to predict what will happen in an aggregate of small particles. But we can never know the cause, or we can never predict the exact position or speed of a particle. And that is used in a series of conferences called the Solvay conferences to say that physics and nature are no longer predictable, that you cannot have cause and effect, that all you can have is probability. And Einstein, in a famous conference in 1927, rejected that view. He said that while it's useful to have these formulations so you can make certain predictions, that's not the whole story, that there's more to it, that there are higher causes. And Einstein's view was rejected and was replaced by this probabilistic view of nature from Heisenberg. And it was quite funny. One of the attacks on LaRouche recently was to say that he is such a conspiracy theorist that he attacks Aristotle John Maynard Keynes, Heisenberg, and Timothy Leary. So why would they throw Heisenberg in there? Was this idea of uncertainty that we cannot know, and it was taken beyond that to say that not only that you cannot know for sure the position or the speed of these particles, that nature itself is uncertain. And that there was this false debate that said, well, are you a deterministic believer or are you a probabilistic believer? Because in the 1900s, you had people like Laplace who did a lot of work on these formulas for celestial mechanics. He was famous to say that if this is a particle in space, if you know its X, Y, and Z position, and you know its speed, then you can predict where it will be in the future, and you can go back and say where it was in the past. And if you had a supercomputer that could determine all particles, then you could predict everything that would come to pass in the future and in the past. So that was deterministic. And in the 1920s, it was said, well, we can't say that anymore, but we have to say everything is probabilistic. Is that you have the probability of an electron being here or there, but you can't tell where it is. Einstein rejected both views and said that, no, well, we've had these breakthroughs of the quantum and the general theory, but these are not complete. Just like Kepler's laws were a breakthrough, but he didn't know about Neptune. He didn't know about Uranus. He didn't know about the other galaxies. So his ideas were a breakthrough, but it's not the whole story. Just like Einstein's breakthroughs are significant, but there's more to learn. In the Soviet conferences, there was something called the Copenhagen interpretation. It said that, well, these are interesting philosophical questions, but for what we want to do on Earth, all we need to do is be able to make predictions, and we don't have to worry about the causes. That we can't determine the causes anyway. And that's the fight on to this day.
Einstein famously said, God does not shoot dice.
Right. Because if you think about it, all these guys are gamblers.
Yes.
And a lot of the formulas for derivatives comes from this probabilistic idea.
From what?
Probability. That if you know the price and the consumption of a commodity, you can determine using these formulas what the price will be in the future for futures contracts. And it works. Two guys got Nobel Prizes for this. The Black-Scholes. And a year after they got the Nobel Prize, their company, Long-Term Capital Management, went bankrupt. And it was bailed out by the Fed and the Wall Street banks.
Oh, no.
You know, I don't want to monopolize the questions, but so if somebody else has a question, otherwise I'm going to ask.
Oh, but it's for Brian, so go ahead if you're
Okay.
Joel.
Yeah, Joel, I have another question. You mentioned Einstein's, the idea that Einstein used to describe correctly the fluctuation in the transit of Mercury.
You see the orbit of Mercury
In the orbit.
is elliptical, so
Right.
this is perihelion, and this is the aphelion, furthest away. every 88 days, and it doesn't cross the sun every 88 days because it's millions of miles away and it's tilted in its orbit. But every 88 days, the perihelion shifts, it drifts, and that can be explained by the influence of Jupiter and the other planets on Mercury. But there is a deviation, even taking into account Jupiter and other planets, that can't be explained by just the gravitational forces. What Einstein showed is that gravity is not just force at a distance acting instantaneously, but gravity is the warping of space-time in the vicinity of a mass, so that Mercury is actually following the least path orbit of the sun because it is falling into the well, the gravitational well of the sun. And because of its speed, it's not falling into the planet, into the sun, but it's orbiting the sun. And that deviation of its perihelion is explained by Einstein's general theory.
Meaning that there's a shift in the gravitational well around the sun.
Right.
That's caused by
the warping of space-time.
Uh-huh.
And that was the first confirmation of the general theory in 1915. 4 years after that, what Einstein also predicts with this general theory is that light, which has no mass, electromagnetic radiation, he predicts that light around a huge mass will bend. The only way you can see that is if you have an eclipse of the sun so that the brightness is blocked out. And if there's a star positioned very close to the rim of the sun, say it's this position, that when the Earth, because you're rotating around the sun, so that when you come around to where you can observe the star in the sun,
On the edge of the sun.
right at the rim of the sun, it's in a certain position. When the Earth is on this side, and you're looking at the star, there's no sun in the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that you take the position of that star, and when the Earth is on this side and the sun is in the way, you normally can't see the difference because it's so bright. But if the moon eclipses the sun, and because the sun is now between Earth and this distant star, the light from that star will appear to shift a very small angle, like 1.7 seconds apart. Remember, you have this is 180 degrees. That reminds me of a guy at a table one time in New Hampshire. I was talking to him. He said, "Wow, you shifted my view 360 degrees." So, it wasn't like I shit. He came back to the same spot. But in every degree, you have 60 minutes of arc. In every minute, you have 60 seconds. So it's a very small angular difference. Now, in 1919,
Showing that the light had been bent.
right, that the light had moved, had shifted. Now, in 1919, there was an expected eclipse of the sun. So a British astronomer, Eddington, who happened to be a Quaker, so he wasn't drafted in World War I, but he thought that what would be better to bring about peace than for a British or English astronomer to confirm one of the laws from a German scientist, Einstein. So he had an expedition which was near Brazil, Syria, one of the islands off of Brazil's coast. And in May of that year, he had all his equipment and photo plates, and he looked up there, and there was this moon coming up, eclipsing the sun in the clouds. Yeah. It looked like, well, it's not over, because the eclipse can be observed only in a limited strip on Earth. And magically, the clouds parted, and he was able to take plates, photographic plates.
Wow.
And measuring these plates months later, he was able to see that star with the eclipse was off by exactly the amount forecast by Einstein.
Wow.
And that's what made Einstein famous. There's the headline of the New York Times said, "Light moves, light shattered, the heavens tremble." Wow, headlines.
I'd like to ask one other thing. At the risk of boring
Is there
everybody
anything
else.
else here?
Yeah. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, it's for Brian though.
Yeah, that's
Okay, so Brian, for the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648,
You
right?
can stay right there.
Oh.
Okay.
I'll just get on the camera.
Oh, boy. I don't want to eclipse.
Who were the individuals, okay, who pulled together the writing and setting it down, the treaty, okay?
Well, maybe Joel can help me, but Richelieu, Mazarin,
Mazarin,
yeah.
Mazarin.
were key figures. I mean, I can't say more. I'm not trying to pretend I'm an expert on the history of the period. You know,
Yeah,
30
yeah,
years
so
more than
was it actually the French
treaty.
that took the leadership then in pulling this?
Well, it is
Well, at that point, I think France was the only real nation state, because Germany was just principalities, dukedoms, and you had the Holy Roman Empire based in Vienna. So France basically stayed out of most of the war until the very end. And you had the Swedes and you had the Danish. So I don't know all the other personalities, but the main were the Cardinal Mazarin, France.
And who actually organized, I mean, what an organizing job to pull together these semi-nations or nations. And who actually did the organizing to pull it together? And it was held in
Westphalia.
Westphalia. Okay, Germany, which
Yes.
wasn't Germany then, okay. So who was the leader to actually pull it all together?
You should.
I know, I
Because
should
it's all
read- I
in
know.
history books. I
Of
mean, you
course,
should.
yeah.
I mean, it was a
'Cause what-
long-term diplomatic effort by all. You know, there's people involved from different sides. You know, that wanted to end the war. I mean, look at the situation now. I mean, just by analogy. I mean, there's Americans, there's French, there's Germans. You know, there's Steinmeier, the foreign minister of Germany, just yesterday was speaking of basically an arc of peace from Vancouver to Vladivostok. You know, I mean, he's never spoken these terms before, I would say. You know, in terms of, so you have all kinds of, you have people in various nations attempting to call a halt to you know, the tragedy, to the ongoing, you know, endless war. So I'm sorry, I can't comment.
No,
in
I
terms
know,
of the
I know I can
specifics.
read about this, I know, but.
Yeah. No, you're
Yeah,
gonna be.
besides this,
I have a question.
Yeah.
Can you restate what exactly went down with the Yamama, the agreement between Bandar bin Sultan and Thatcher?
Well, the prehistory, of, if you will, to the agreement, anomaly was that the U.S. Congress rejected a U.S. arms sale to Saudi Arabia. And
What year was
it-
that?
85, I think. Was
Okay. And so then as the story goes, Prince Bandar, who was himself trained as a British fighter pilot, he had gone to school, private school in Britain, and been trained as a British fighter pilot. Already as a leader of one of the part of the royal family of Britain, engaged in these ongoing negotiations, which involved Thatcher herself. And the agreement essentially was to provide, this was at the point in which Saudi Arabia felt threatened by Iraq, that Britain would provide fighter planes, a certain number of fighter planes, pilots, because Saudi Arabia didn't have sufficient pilots at that point, but then provide all the ongoing logistics to maintain those fighter planes and so forth in Saudi Arabia, for the indefinite future. So that essentially Britain would provide Saudi Arabia with its defense capabilities, from soup to nuts. And in exchange for that, the agreement was that Saudi Arabia would ship to, this was through the company BAE, British Aerospace Systems, was the actual company that was providing these fighter planes and logistics and so on and so forth, would sell or would pay in the form of a tanker load of oil a day to BAE, but it would go to the British government. The British government would then sell the oil, right, and then pay to BAE what it had coming to it. But the amount coming from the oil was far more than what was required to pay BAE. And there was obviously a lot of money that went to payoffs, bribes, and so forth, various people getting their cut of the action in this agreement. And there was an official British investigation of this, which was shut down by Tony Blair.
Oh.
That's another story. It's partly covered in the biography, but you can look up the Al Yamama Accord as well. And that resulted in the creation of, the oil was sold on the spot market. The oil tankers would arrive and they'd be sold at whatever the going price of the oil was on a given day in the spot market. So there was a growing slush fund, which was created in the process of this. The money coming, there was no money coming from Saudi Arabia, so it was off the books of the Saudis because they were just shipping oil.
So through their oil, they were purchasing weapons.
Right.
And
At the same time, there was a surplus of money being generated, which went into offshore accounts and became a slush fund, which was used
for terrorism.
right to fund various covert operations internationally. And I just read one short segment, but there's more in the book. But we published, I believe, at least 2 special reports detailing many more aspects of it.
So what about the weapons that Obama just was selling to the Saudis? Is this in cooperation with the
It would be in parallel.
parallel?
Yeah, the British are still selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. In fact, that's a big political
They're
fight.
using some of it up to blow up.
Yeah, Yemen. Yeah, they got to be continually resupplied. So they're still being supplied from both Britain and from the United States. Saudi Arabia.
So the British are supplying weapons that are being used to kill Americans and others.
Yeah, well,
And they're
Yemen in
international.
particular, but yes,
Yeah,
you could say
terror.
yes.
It was also, I think, mentioned that Prince Bandar himself had an account with $2 billion
As part of the
as part of
El Yamama
Yeah.
deal in the United States,
Uh-huh.
and received regular checks, as Jeff mentioned the other night, from the Defense Department of Britain while he was ambassador in the United States as part of the ongoing payments to him for his role in the El Yamama agreement. So Bandar was nominally representing Saudi Arabia, but he was also on the payroll of the British government.
But he also was very close to George Bush.
Right.
Bush family.
Father and son, yeah.
And he paid the checks for at least two of the hijackers in San Diego.
That's no.
Yeah, but I'm saying that there had to be, I mean, is there indication from that book that there was a bigger plan that both he and Bush were agreed upon, as you know, that he was doing this because the intelligence community was cooperating?
Well, Prince Bandar went back to head Saudi intelligence. That's what he did after being ambassador to the United States for, I think it was like 20 years, 15 to 20 years.
And you know who his lawyer is?
Let's see.
His American attorney.
And the head of the FBI. Or
Yeah,
Louis Freeh, the former head of the
That's right,
FBI.
That's right.
just a coincidence.
Louis Freeh.
There's a Los Angeles Times article in
Yeah,
Louis Freeh.
Where's the people screaming, you know, he's got conflict of interest here.
Because they're too worried about what Kim Kardashian did last week and Dancing
Yeah,
with the Stars.
Yeah, she bends over, she puts this up.
Yeah,
I was just gonna say, I thought it was really interesting in the statement we were reading about the living memorial, Ryan, about the humiliation of the American people due to the fact that after 9/11, nothing in reality was done to address the murder of these citizens. But I also think, to elaborate on that, I think that another part of the humiliation, which people have to remain conscious of, is that we actually have murdered many more of our citizens and many more people around the world through engaging in wars on false pretense of doing something about 9/11. And I think that's also part of the humiliation that the American people have to come to terms with, to address this, because, I mean,
Well, this is in the context, next weekend is Memorial Day.
right.
So this is in the context of Memorial Day, a memorial to our own soldiers, our own fallen.
Yeah.
Yeah, but no, it's true what you're saying, and for allowing Lyndon LaRouche to be put in prison,
Yeah, because he was put in jail, what, 1989?
and just the I'm sorry.
It was 1989 or 1989?
Yes, right after the elections,
Yeah.
he ran for president and then threw him in prison
Uh-huh.
for the beginning of the next year. 88.
What are they throwing him in prison for?
Conspiracy.
Yeah, it's a conspiracy to avoid paying taxes. They never. There was no evidence that he had not paid taxes, but they said he was engaged in a conspiracy nonetheless, even though there was no evidence that he had avoided it. And it paid his taxes according to the advice of his
He
attorney.
was in jail for 5 years.
Yeah, 5 years. And subject. I was just gonna say. I mean, that it's another story, but I mean, Einstein himself, along with his wife, both were subjected to FBI persecution. Through the latter part of his life. The whole. I don't know when it started, but certainly the whole post-World War II period up until his death.
Well, even before the war, because he was prevented from being part of the Manhattan Project.
Oh, that's right.
Even though that was his idea to write a letter to Roosevelt about uranium in a potential.
So he wasn't allowed to participate at all?
Right, because they wouldn't give him the clearance, security clearance. And his file, I think somebody has recovered, it's like 5,000 pages of FBI documents. It's nice.
See, and this, of course, is something we see with the 28 pages. It's now no longer the 28 pages. Then it's the 47 pages of documents, 17 that's been made public by the FOIA. Then it's the 80,000 pages that have become public of the FBI's documents in Sarasota,
Well,
Florida, which were
those are-
never made public before
those
to
are-
anybody.
Those aren't public yet.
No, they're being reviewed by a federal
No,
judge.
they were subpoenaed by a federal judge, and the federal judge has them.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah,
He's
and
reading.
that's why Bob Graham says there has to be a new investigation into 9/11, because the FBI lied to the Congress and said, we don't have any documents on Sarasota.
On and on, yeah.
And was Louis Freeh the head of the FBI at that time? Or when did
He left a week before 9/11.
Really?
And then,
Mueller came in.
yeah, Mueller had been in charge of the FBI office, or he had been, Mueller,
Boston.
yeah, in Boston, in prosecuting LaRouche. The first investigation that failed, the first court case against LaRouche that failed in federal court in Boston resulted in a hung jury. Well, that operation was set up by Mueller. He came in after Freeh, just before 9/11.
Yeah, so it was a handoff.
Yeah, right.
Didn't Rumsfeld give a press conference the day before that there was a whole bunch of money missing? And those documents are actually stored in the exact spot that that plane supposedly hit?
I
Don't-
Yeah, I don't, yeah, it sounds like a.
Conspiracy.
Yeah.
But it's not hidden. It's
Yeah,
like the Purloined Letter.
Right, that's right.
The FBI has been a treasonous organization since its inception. And the Kennedy assassination, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, it's all out in the open. It's not a secret.
What was it, Charles, it was Napoleon's grandson or,
Bonaparte, yeah,
Bonaparte.
or nephew or grandnephew.
Louis Bonaparte.
Yeah, Louis Bonaparte was one of the founders of the FBI.
Mhm.
So it's modeled on what?
MI5,
British
Yeah.
domestic intelligence,
I mean,
and it serves the Queen.
yeah, and what you're saying about it being in the open, like the Purloined Letter, is this treason is so obvious because, I mean, I just finished reading this book that maybe you read long ago, Official and Confidential, you know, a biography of J. Edgar Hoover.
Yeah.
And remember, he was a queen himself.
Written by this Irish historian, Anthony Sutton.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and, you know, I mean, throughout the 30s, he was a known friend of the top organized crime figures. I mean, he would appear with them at the racetracks. He would be with them in Florida.
He guessed at their boxes.
He was guest at the boxes. He would stay at their resorts on the West Coast. Same thing with Texas here. It's very interesting. I didn't know this. But, and then I decided to just look up a few things. But Texas, at least around the 40s, the oil industry is very tied into organized crime. And there was a whole relationship between this guy Murchison and this other guy Richardson. These two people who all of us have heard of, you know, in relation to Texas history. But they were like the Texas Mafia, and Hoover was with them all the time. I mean, they were in bed together the whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to bring it up to today, a lot of people are soft on Trump. Remember, Roy Cohn was Trump's lawyer. And Roy Cohn was very close to Hoover.
Yeah.
McCarthy,
Oh, he was
Yeah.
Trump's
McCarthy.
lawyer?
he was Trump's lawyer in the 80s.
I'm sorry.
Before he died in
Yeah, Roy
AIDS.
Cohn.
There's a press conference that was on 9/10 of 2001 Rumsfeld gave, and it's on YouTube. that $2.3 trillion was missing out of their budget,
I'm
out of the Pentagon's. They couldn't account for it.
Oh,
I doubt it.
that's huge.
I just doubt that it's an actual press conference of Donald Rumsfeld. Maybe it's somebody else's.
Well, he
YouTube
said something
presentation.
about the bureaucracy. It's
Oh.
the defense department bureaucracy, but he was also, I think he was part of the project for a new American century.
Rumsfeld.
Rumsfeld, at least both of which. And these are the guys in '97 who said, well, what we really need is a new Pearl Harbor to galvanize Americans in this fight to maintain the American century, or the American Empire, the British American Empire.
So the building with the name on it, the FBI Hoover building, really should be, destroyed and changed sometime soon.
Well, we can change, don't forget the airport here is Bush Airport. So
Yeah. Destroy the infrastructure, we could just use it as something, could like turn it into a multi-level.
Yeah,
a homeless shelter.
yeah, I mean, it's, we're talking about the purloined letter, right, of
Gator.
Well, that's the point of the 28
Excuse me.
pages and the Jasper bill, is that's how we get the
Okay,
job
well,
done.
we're saying, it's out in the open, right? It's out in the open what the evil of the FBI institution and J. Edgar Hoover, okay? So,
Increasingly, yeah.
yeah, recently, okay.
Increasingly, I'm saying.
Increasingly, okay, but actually for a long time. So here we are with this huge building, honoring Hoover with his name on it. I mean, we say, it's one of the landmarks of Washington, D.C. I mean, that's disgusting.
Oh, I agree completely. I'm just saying in terms of
I mean,
in terms of our activity and what we need to do as citizens.
Yeah.
Yeah. We got a bunch of people running around and taking Confederate names off of statues. I agree with that too.
That's true. That's
But
true.
what we've got is something as bad or worse than the Confederacy running the country right now, which has to be brought down. And the 28 pages, is the flank that we can now turn, thanks to what Putin already did, to bring it down. I mean, this is not about, the 28 pages is not about, Harley Slanger was making this point the other day in discussion. The Jasper bill, okay, well, it's passed the Senate unanimously. Now it goes to the House. Obama is saying he won't pass it. He'll veto it, right?
Well, they could override the veto.
Okay, so if they overrode it, okay, well then so then the 9/11 families have a chance to go to court, and that's going to wind through the courts. It's going to take several years, and hopefully they'll get some recompense, some closure and justice, right?
Yeah.
However, this is bigger than that.
Yeah.
This is about bringing down the whole national security state, so-called, that's been built up since the creation of the FBI. That's what the 28 pages.
Then what about if
is
the
like-
Iraqis sue us for bombing them for weapons of mass destruction that never materialized?
Then they get to.
Well,
Well, they have a right to
that's
do that.
They get to close Bush.
yeah, we'll pay them back with the new Silk Road. We'll work those things out.
But Ryan, the point is, it's a plan to bring down the shadow government.
Right,
The government in the wings of, we've always been exposing over the years, but this is a flank that's now.
That's broken
It's
because,
bringing it into the public conscience.
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
it's very exciting.
And it wouldn't be happening now without a broad movement within, not necessarily fully conscious, but movement within the institutions. When you have Cornyn of Texas joining with Schumer, of
New York.
New York,
Yeah.
just like
Such an unlikely
Just-
alliance.
such unlikely alliances to
That's almost a piece of Westphalia.
yeah, there you go.
Ah.
A small piece
The
of
principle of
Westphalia.
Westphalia.
Yeah, maybe. Well, let's make it that, yes.
They had on one of the shows, Special Forces guys said that the reason why they didn't have any weapons, or said they didn't have any weapons of mass destruction, is because all the boxes had "Made in the USA" on it. And so they had to sweep that under the rug because we were given Saddam the weapons that fight the Iranians in the 80s.
Well, it's a world nightmare. Hopefully we bring it to an end.
Yeah, but all the regime change.
What I'd like to just propose is that we close the meeting, we can then continue the discussion. Why don't we